Hello, everyone. This is Toto, Two Rabbis, Three Opinions. I'm Rabbi Barry Diamond, along with Rabbi Ari Averbach from Temple Adat Elohim and Temple Eitz Chaim, respectively. We come together to discuss the issues of the day, especially around the book Uncomfortable Conversations with the Jew, where we have our congregations joining in lots of book groups to discuss these ideas. Ari, welcome. It's so good to be with you.
So nice to see you, to share time with you. I love it.
And today we're talking about something totally non-controversial, which is so helpful, race. And and what are we? Are we white? Are we not white? Are we something in the middle? Is that even the right category to talk about this stuff? So we assume that at some point we're going to step in some kind of landmine just because we all have our blind spots. And sometimes those blind spots are telling and open up the possibility of conversation. And above all, we are confirming and affirming and supporting the ideas of having uncomfortable conversations and being able to say silly, stupid things and to have that as an entree for further discussion.
I hope you'll all forgive us for in case we step in that little tiny, and even some of the things that aren't landmines now. I know that, somebody listens to this a few years from now and they go, I can't believe you can't say that now. On the way here, I was actually listening to Avenue Q, and the song was The More You Rub Someone, which I don't even know if I could, but that's like, it's spelled RUV. And like, knowing that there are things that they can say and there are things that they can't say, but they said it anyway. We're in a safe space here. So thank you all for being forgiving.
A safe space with all of our friends out there and anyone else who decides to download this. So let's start with just a larger topic, which is like, what is race anyway? And in order to talk about it, I wanted to imagine that there is someone walking towards us on the street. We don't know who they are. And how do we decide how to deal with them? Do we treat them as though they are a friend or a foe, they are a threat, or they are going to be helpful? That's one of the things that we as human beings have to deal with, and that, to be honest, all animals have to deal with it as well. How am I going to deal with this person ahead of me? And that the natural thing that we are going to do is to place people in some kind of categories. This is not new or not surprising, but the need to place people in some kind of a category so that we can feel like we know what they're going to do, and therefore we can adjust how we're going to deal with them. That is the kind of the neutral idea of discrimination. We are discriminating between different groups, not with a value necessarily, but with some way of organizing the world.
Right. And I also think that we're in a place right now in the world where we are realizing that there aren't very neat boxes. Like, it used to be that there was black or white, male or female, Catholic or heathen. Like, there were just very simple categories. And it's strange how many people are now both of whatever, right? It couldn't be 100 years ago. There were no people who were both Jewish and Christian.
Right.
And we could, like, I know that there's like, can they actually be Jewish and Christian at the same time, theologically? But there are people who are raising their families both. And we accept it.
And those categories can be sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing. I think those are things that we are all trying to make sense of in the world. I mean, you're right. It used to be, you were Jewish or you were a goy, right? Goy just meaning a word for the other nations of the world, even though it kind of came out later, came to have a kind of a derogatory sense to it.
Right. And even though the first time I think we see goy in the Torah is that Abraham is promised to be a goy gadol, like and you translate that now as like a large non-Jew. No, like a great nation. And it's like the first people described as a goy are Jews. And now we use it right as anybody who's not a Jew is part of the goyim, part of the nations of the world.
Yeah, and as we think about the idea of race and move to the idea of race, one of the things that we actually see even in the Torah to some degree is the idea that people can be servants, they can even be slaves, right? Something that we don't like to think about in the Torah, and the idea of slavery in the Torah is certainly very different than the chattel slavery that we had in the United States. But the idea of slavery within history has been pretty common.
Yeah.
And the who can be a slave was, basically anyone of any color, any background can be a slave if you were, taken over, conquered by another people. Jews became slaves to the Romans after they were conquered in 70. Um,
Right.
but there's a challenge, and the challenge let me, before we say that, matter of fact, the word slave comes from Slavic, right? So that the Slavs, who were, Eastern European white, they were that's where the very term comes from. So
Right.
slaves could be of any background. Um, but it changed a little bit at different times in history, and one of the times that it changed was when the organization of chattel slavery developed in the United States, and maybe it developed in other ways. I don't know whether this applies to other places as well. It may, but one of the things that you want to know is if you have someone who's working for you as a indentured servant or a slave in general, if that person runs away, they can easily meld into the rest of society and escape. So it is helpful. It was back then. I mean, it's kind of horrible to think about it this way, but it was helpful to be able to distinguish between those people who could be slaves. And if you saw them outside of a particular environment, you would know that you would have to go and retrieve them and bring them back.
Hmm.
And so it became helpful then to choose people who look differently than the owners. So if the owners, at least in the United States and in some other places, were white, then choosing someone who was had black skin made it simpler to figure out who was in that role, that class of slave. Um, and I mean, I think we should all feel uncomfortable with that. Obviously, it almost goes without saying. But I think if we understand that, then we start to see that these terms aren't just that these terms have a basis in history rather than a basis in biology. Um, but the slave owners had a challenge of their own. And the challenge that they had is like sometimes it could feel bad to to be enslaving other people. So one of the things that they did is they started to justify what they did. It's not just that these people have a different color skin so that we can tell them apart, but that we as the slave owners are somehow better, and that the slaves are somehow inferior to justify what they're doing to other human beings. And it's from that that the ideology of inferiority developed. That people with black skin were not just our slaves, but they were inferior. They deserved that. That it seemed like that's the place where they should be in society. Um, and all of a sudden, this whole ideology developed. And it was in that context that science started to develop. And as science started to develop, it was taking the categories of the world as they understood it, and they were trying to figure out what's real, what's not real, what can we know about the people around us, and what do we not know. So that idea of race was kind of extent; it existed in the world, and science started to take those categories and start applying scientific rigor to those categories. So the idea of race as a scientific category started to develop. And one of the things that shocked me, and I don't know if it did you, is like when you start looking at Jewish writings of the early 20th century or maybe even the late 19th century, it often talks about Jews as a race. And it's just confusing to understand, like, why would they be talking about Jews as a race? But if you understand that it was just like the term that is used for groups of people, and that was the kind of the ideology of the day, then they applied it to lots of different groups, including Jews.
I mean,
Um,
we just weren't considered part of the normal white waspy whatever mainstream, and so it had to be that we were differentiated in some way. And
and
I
when
think it's
yeah,
yeah, I think it's
and
just one of the struggles of in this book and in other books and just in general is what are we? The word religion comes way after the Torah is not a book of theology. We are in some ways not a religion because you don't have to follow a certain tenet or dogma to be Jewish, like you do in other religions. We are a race, but we're kind of not because our skin tone can be different to the way that we currently describe race.
Yeah, exactly. So we could be of any color. We could be, from very dark hues to very light hues. So somehow this idea of using race in the early 20th century um, is just confusing. And ultimately that use of race as science applied it kind of came to the apex in the Nazi ideology. And I think it was partially in that Nazi ideology that people started to see that race was a terrible category to use because it essentializes people. It says there's one thing that is important about you, and that is what race that you belong to. And this is just as, Darwin had not been around very long. So the idea of passing on traits and characteristics was an important idea. And you could understand how someone could take this thought that, well, if you pass down these traits, there might be dangerous, harmful, negative traits that pass down. And that's where this kind of racial theory that got incorporated into Nazism um, grew from. So after the Holocaust, people started to say race is not a good, helpful category. Um, and that it really doesn't tell us that much in general. So in the 1950s, the UN, it's actually UNESCO, said that you can't use race to determine intelligence, which is a scientific question, or worth, which is a moral question. Yeah,
They said it, but here we are, whatever this is, 60, 80 years later, I think people still are. And,
100%. Yeah.
and it's getting more and more murky because there are more people of different backgrounds, right? It used to be that the Germans lived over there and the Italians lived over there and the Irish lived over there. And now it's not like that. Any town that we live in is a big mix of all sorts of people. So it's all the races are not all and not completely. And this isn't totally, um, a melting pot, but we are more mixed now than we were before. And we're still trying to figure out, some people are trying to figure out what race other people are. And yeah.
Yeah, and is it even helpful to talk about races? Like, is a race a meaningful term? Like when you look at science, they will say, well, like there's not a significant, meaningful biological meaning to the idea of race, which I think is mostly true. I don't think it's totally true because if an African American person, a dark skin, I'm not even sure how to talk about it in a neutral way, goes to a doctor, the one of the things they might say is that you might have a higher likelihood to have sickle cell anemia, right? That doesn't mean that every person with dark skin whose family reaches back to Africa is going to have it, or people from Haiti might have a different a degree of possibility of having that. But there's some kind of slightly helpful way to say that in general there's a group, and then it has physical characteristics that could be scientifically meaningful.
Sure. If you're an Ashkenazi Jew, you are more prone to certain diseases. And if you're looking to get married and have a genetic test and everything else, then we know that you are certain things to look for. And the only person I know who died of sickle cell anemia was not Black.
Really
I mean,
interesting.
which just how it is. There was an interesting story not long ago about a white couple who adopted a kid. The kid happened to be born to two Hispanic parents, but is being raised by white parents in a suburb. Um, and the kid passes for white. You wouldn't know that this kid's birth heritage is Hispanic. And then the question it was, can this kid apply for Hispanic scholarships at college? Now, this kid has no Hispanic, um, you know, familial heritage and doesn't pass as Hispanic, passes as white, being raised by white parents. What is the race of this child? And I got contacted recently from an organization that wants to work with Jews of color, teen Jews of color, which some people balked at, going like, that's terrible. Why would you try to other them? Which is a different conversation, I guess. But what do you do with white parents who are raising a Black kid, or Black parents who are raising a white kid, or a white kid raised by white parents, but whose adopted siblings are Black? And you go, which of these can be part of this program? They're being raised in the same household. And we're still facing some, I guess, level of discrimination, which is why it's being brought up at all.
Yeah, and in some ways that deals with the idea that the racial element is the most important thing that you could say about someone, and that we give lots of support based on their race, which you kind of understand given the history of suffering of the African American community and the descendants of slaves. But there are lots of questions. Well, what if you don't have that history? What if you can't trace your family back to slavery? Questions about reparations. I think those are all valuable and important discussions, but they're dancing around the issue of what is the role of race. And getting back to Jews for a second, the question is, so are we a race? So we know that race has a limited benefit in terms of how we talk about it. We know that Jews come from all areas of the world and are lots of different hues from dark to light.
Right.
So what are we, right? Especially because Judaism developed before the idea of the word religion and certainly the word race. So what are we?
Yeah. I mean, this is just because we're kind of launching this from the book Uncomfortable Conversations with a Jew. This is with love where the book really lost me. It is chapter 4 is the Jewish race, and they talk all about how Jews are all sorts of colors and all sorts of backgrounds. And she says, it's what got us into a sticky situation with a guy named Adolf Hitler, in her quirky way of talking about atrocious history. I cut to the chase on that one. The answer is a definitive no, that we are not a race. And then to think also, I don't know, 4 years ago, Whoopi Goldberg got into a bit of trouble because she said that Jews aren't a race. And all of these Jewish groups were up in arms and said, you have to apologize. And like, she needed to go to the Museum of Tolerance, and she needed to go to the Holocaust Museum and read a book because Jews are definitively a race.
Yeah, if I remember that, I think the issue that she was dealing with, which is really an interesting issue, is that like that Jews don't necessarily suffer the way that members of the Black community suffer, because we can get by without looking Black, right?
Sure. If you walk down the street without a kippah on, without a Jewish star out, nobody knows the difference between Barry Diamond and the Lutheran pastor down the street. I mean, you could be
with this face though, they just
no,
know. They
no,
just
you
know.
could be anything, which is interesting. I think that's like trying to get into Emmanuel Acho's head in this book is that's one of his struggles is she's going, Judaism isn't a race. And then his response after she goes through pages of Judaism isn't a race, um, the final line in the chapter is, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. Are Jewish people white? And with all due respect to Emmanuel Acho, who I believe is probably great and smart and wonderful, I wrote in my book, Is He Stupid? Because she just went through pages of Jews can be from any background. There are Asian Jews and Indian Jews and Hispanic Jews and Black Jews and white Jews. But I think one of the places that he's struggling is in America today, there is still great racism, institutional racism, that we don't feel in the same way, that Barry Diamond doesn't feel the same way Emmanuel Acho does, who he can't trace his ancestry to slavery. His family came here 40 years ago from Nigeria. So he's not part of the historical. He feels like more of an immigrant than he feels like a descendant of chattel slavery. And he knows that there is still a power imbalance in race in this country. Right. Just a couple of years ago, there was an experiment. A Black professor put his house on the market, and it was valued at $350,000. He then took down all of the pictures of his Black family, didn't put up pictures of white family, just took down the pictures of his Black family, and had a white couple show the house to realtors, and it was valued at double the price.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And to go, okay, that's awful. And we, as pale-skinned people, right? I'm pretty pasty, and my dermatologist is always mad at me. And it just doesn't play off the same way, at least in this part of the country. I don't know what it's like selling a house with a mezuzah on it in other parts of the country, but here it's not an issue. And Emmanuel Acho is part of a tradition in America that he was brought into only a generation ago, that this is the reality. And so he's seeing it, are Jewish people white? Not all Jewish people are white, but you and I are passing for white. And when a police officer pulls us over, we have different feelings than when Emmanuel Acho is pulled over by a police officer.
Yeah, I think that there is a difference in the way that the term whiteness and blackness is used. So that, like in that interchange, I felt like Emmanuel Acho and Noah Tishby were just going right past each other, using the same word, but having such a different cultural context that they felt like they were communicating, but they really weren't communicating. So I don't think that when he says, are Jews white, I don't think he was asking a racial question. I think he was asking the question, um, are you part of the power structure? Right? Do you have power? And are you going to be attacked or suppressed by others when you can sneak by and pass as someone who's part of the majority culture? And I think that's what Whoopi Goldberg was saying. That's why, like, I felt badly at how she was treated. Like, I don't think that she should have been treated like that. I think that was really an opening, not to do penance, but to have the kind of discussion that we're having right now. And the question is the color of one's skin, is race the main or only factor that we need to know about someone to know, like, everything that we need to know about them? And I think that Noah Tishby is saying, no, that's not everything we need to know about them. And the fact that we might be able to pass, that some of Jews can pass into the white community and some might not be able to pass in the white community, that may not be the most important thing to talk about when we're talking about Jews. And I think that's where Manuel Acho, to his credit, I am so appreciative of his entering into this entire dialogue, that he's asking this naive question, which is actually a very deep question. And the answer is there's more to it. And it's not just around the color of the skin. Um, the you know the um, and I was looking at page 38. I think this central tension between the Black and Jewish community. Then the purpose of this for the purpose of this conversation between two people who are currently in America, is it fair to say that Jewish people are white and as a result have access to privilege that comes with it? Yeah, because I feel like this is a part of the disconnect. In America, my Jewish brothers and sisters have privilege of being perceived as white.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, they've not been discriminated against in America based on the color of their skin. They did not have to suffer Jim Crow laws or public abuse about justice at the hands of police.
Right.
And the answer is that may be true to a certain extent, but that's also not the only reason that people will discriminate against other people. So if your focus is on, and your life experience is that I am discriminated because of the color of my skin, then you assume that if you don't have that issue with color, that everything should be, I was going to say hunky dory, but that just doesn't sound like the right thing to say. So I take that back. Everything is going to be just fine. And I think that's the invitation to say, no, it's not just fine for Jews just because we can often be in the white community. And sometimes we can't be in the white community when there are other parts of our identity that is at odds with the kind of the culture with power.
Sure. I mean, the fact that we talk about the Judeo-Christian culture here, it's not Judeo, it's Christian. We've had a Black president. We've not had a Jewish president or a Jewish vice president. And when Kamala Harris was trying to pick a vice president, everybody thought it would be Josh Shapiro. And it wasn't, because putting a Jew on the ballot, especially in the last couple of years, was like not a possibility. And yet having a Black person on the ticket didn't. I'm sure there's issues with that too. But it's happened, and it hasn't happened for the Jewish population here yet. Not that that's the deciding factor of it. And again, like, we're talking about white Jews. We have a lot of people in our communities who can't pass as white.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think also troubling is some of them can't pass as Jews, right? You made a comment about your beautiful face, that you look Jewish. And as one of the things that I think that our generation now has to get over is not saying people look Jewish. I wish that we all looked like Natalie Portman and Gal Gadot and whoever else the hot Jews these days are. But how many people of color are Jewish? I remember Quincy Jones died recently, and he was talking to somebody. Who was he talking to? And before he died, and he said, "Oh, I produced a couple of Jews." And the person said, "Oh, which artists are you talking about?" He goes, "No, my children." And right, what is it like to be somebody who, as you're coming to shul, and both of our synagogues, like almost every synagogue in the country or the world, has a huge security budget, not big enough, but huge. And what does it mean to be a pasty white person who walks into shul, gives a security guard a smile, and walks right in, and can sit down in the second row, and somebody comes up and goes, "Will you care for an aliyah today? You look new here," as opposed to somebody who's Black or Hispanic or Asian or Indian or some other skin tone. And does security give them a harder time when they're here? Are they offered an aliyah or an ark opening, or is it assumed that they are not Jewish? When they're at Kiddush or Oneg afterwards trying to have a babka, are they asked questions by some of the elders in the community saying, "I'm so glad you're here. So are you Jewish?" And so now these are people who aren't fitting into any of the worlds. They're seen as other in our white culture. They're seen as other in our Jewish culture. And they go, can't I just be Jewish here? And it's one of the places that I'm struggling with this organization that wants to invite our teen Jews of color into this separate program. Do they want to be othered, or do they want to just be congregants? Do they want to be with other people who understand their struggle? Um, and am I always just going up to them going, hey, you're different. Do you want to go to this different program that's for different people like you? I'm having a hard time with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, is the is their race the essential thing to focus on? And to be honest, I would leave that to them to decide. Um, but but it's hard to know, like, should that be the focus, or should it be that you're part of this group and that we should be helping our own members to understand that Jews come in all sorts of colors, depending on the part of the world that you come from, or the part of the world that your congregants come from. But I wanted to get back to one thing that Emmanuel Ochi said that I thought was interesting, and that I really struggled with. He said on page 39, but I wrestle with the fact that a Black person has to worry about inherent disrespect and daily danger by law enforcement, and you don't. And I think that's a point of great tension. Um,
Yeah.
and there's part of me that says, yes, I could see that. Um, I It's hard to step in the mind of someone else to know what their experience is. I must say that, and I've talked about this, to my congregants and my students, like the idea of focusing on anti-Semitism is something that I really disliked. I didn't really like focusing on Holocaust as well. Not that they aren't important times in our history, but I just didn't have I didn't have an overwhelming experience of anti-Semitism. So
Mhm.
for me, it just seemed like we were focusing on it too much. And that we could focus more on the joy of Judaism rather than the oi of Judaism.
Right.
And now I feel like I was wrong, that there was a need to focus on it more. Um, but uh, but but that wasn't my experience. And I think in the same way that there are lots of Jews for whom it was or is their experience, and I have to respect that experience. But I think that as a community, the Jewish community, we can be very sensitive about certain things, right? And I think that being sensitive is good, but being oversensitive may not be good. And it's hard to know where to find that point of the right level of sensitivity. I think that's true for the Black community and for every community. Like, how do you know what's the right level of sensitivity to the things that you fear? Um, so when I see Emmanuel Acha talking about that, it's like I could understand the disrespect that is often leveled against members of the Black community, and being vigilant towards those things. And sometimes that vigilance turns into hypervigilance, just as it does within the Jewish community sometimes. But the thing that kind of bothers me a little bit is the fact that things aren't perfectly even. Like, when he says that's a point of great tension. Like, I am angry with you, other quote minority group, because you're not suffering the way
Mhm.
that I'm suffering. And I may be misreading, and if I am, I would love to be told that I am. But that just feels, it just doesn't seem to be a helpful frame, because
Right.
everyone has different experiences of different elements in their life. And I just feel like if that's the feeling of that tension between the Black and the Jewish community, then I'm troubled by his being troubled.
Yeah, I think that we're often caught in this one downsmanship of who suffered more recently, generationally, in the last millennia, who has gone through worse, who has the right to complain more. In the same way that when our kids complain about something, we go, you know, it could be, right, like there's children starving or whatever the answer is, as if to say you have no right to complain because other people have it worse. And so he does have a sense of that. And also, like, are they hearing each other, or are they talking past each other? Because she's saying in this book about what it means to be Jewish in the world today, she's going, Jewish people are suffering. They're suffering from anti-Semitism. They're suffering from being different. They're suffering from being called a race when we don't see ourselves as a race. And he's like, you think you're suffering from being a race? We're suffering from being a race. And so there is this, like, who has it worse? And there's a great episode of 30 Rock about this. Is it harder to be a woman, or is it harder to be black? And and they both come to the, like, a separate conclusion, but together, or whatever. Of Halle Berry being their prime example of this, is like, she suffered because she's a woman. No, she suffered because she's black. And right, I think that we are in a state of the world that is more fair than it's ever been, and still really far from being fair. And I can't speak for what it was like 160 years ago, and how awful the world must have been. And we're light years beyond that in a way that I think our forefathers of Judaism and our forefathers of America could not have imagined, which is, to me, very hopeful. And it's in the Torah, it says, tzedek, tzedek tirdoth, justice, justice, you shall pursue. And there's writings about this essentially saying you keep pursuing it because you'll never get there.
Hmm.
You're
Yeah.
going to keep on chasing after, pursuing after justice and righteousness and equality. And it's better today. That story about the black professor who couldn't sell his house because he couldn't get the same dollar figure that a white family could have had is awful. And to think that a generation before, during Jim Crow laws, he couldn't have owned a house, and a generation before that, he would have been enslaved or otherwise othered so much more greatly. And so we're light years beyond that. And I hope that we keep pursuing tzedek, righteousness, justice, equality, equanimity. And I think that we're getting closer now than we were before. But it's still a slog, right? When I was a kid, all the kids in my Hebrew school class were Ashka normative, maybe a Persian kid here or there. And now you look at the classes at our religious school, in every class, there's a kid who doesn't look like the Jews from my Hebrew school class. And that's amazing. And the
Yeah,
more
I
we
mean,
have them, and the more that we have their B'nai Mitzvah up on the beam, and they're included, not othered, not spotlighted, but just included normally, the more that I think we're going to inch closer to something in our communities that feels more just.
yeah. First of all, I think that's beautifully said. And I do think that it is difficult when you're still suffering from elements of persecution or just a level of unfairness in general. I could understand being frustrated and wanting that to change right away. Um, and I hope that kind of enlightened people on any political side would feel the trajectory that you are talking about. And whether it's continuing or whether it's taking a step backwards, or those are important debates to have. Right now, I feel like we've taken a step backwards, like in terms of our Jewishness, and our quote whiteness, which really is about having access to a certain amount of power, where at one level we want to be accepted by the general community. We want to be viewed as, white as anyone else in a certain sense. Um, and when we are, we feel good about it, and we build our communities, and we make our businesses, and we find our places in places of power like Congress and otherwise. Um, and yet, so in that sense, we're white. But again, the term white is just not a helpful term. So at a certain point, I think that if we could have an agreement between the Black and the Jewish communities, we should say this is not a helpful term. It just doesn't apply to us. But to the extent that we say, okay, yes, we are kind of integrated into the white community at a certain sense. And then another sense, the fact that we are integrated in the white community and that we have a certain amount of power makes us suspect at the same time. So there's a
Sure.
little bit of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And that's part of what it means to be a majority. I think that, or a minority in a white Christian majority world, country at least, but one that is also, I think, does bring together lots of different groups, and that the power, especially in this democracy, is diffuse. Um, Maybe we would want it to be more diffuse, but I still think that in this community, that it is helpful to be able to see the larger trajectory, and that we've been moving in a great direction. And even now, while I think that we have moved backwards somewhat, I still think that it's still a good and safe place to be, for Jews, hopefully for the Black community as well, and that race is only one facet, and it's certainly not the most important facet for the Jewish community to consider.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
there's so much more to talk about with this.
Which I think we're going to have guests on to help us understand different sides of this as well.
Yeah, so that's a tease for the future. Someone who is a true expert in this. We're working on having a like a bonus episode to talk about this. Um, but hopefully this can tell us that we are not a race. That race might have certain explanatory value in a very narrowed sense, but that Jews are, by the way, I think that in terms of saying what is a Jew, we are an ethnic group, an ethno-religious, religio-ethno, it's like it's hard to come up with categories. Someone said we are a tribe that you can join, right? And in a certain sense, it's a that I think there's something beautiful about that. But I think the other thing that's important is that you you the pathway into Judaism, into modern Judaism, is through a religious door, because that's the way that the rabbis kind of set it up.
Yeah.
Um, but that within that belief structure, boy, there's a huge variety, including people who have no belief at all, to Jews who have deep beliefs in God, but their understandings of God are so radically different as to say, like, I can't even imagine that they are the same.
Yeah.
And yet we somehow live together in this community that views one another as being part of the MOTs, members of the tribe. Um,
It's nice to have a tribe. Nice. I think that's part of this too with race is how do you find your people? Um, and it's not easy as Jews because many of us tuck it away, we hide it away, and we don't all look a certain way. Um, you don't know necessarily who's Jewish and who's not by face or skin color or name. And so, how do you invite more people into your tent and feel comfortable with expanding your tent, with inviting people into the tribe? And so, I will keep exploring this. This is a
Yeah,
worthwhile conversation.
I think this is a really vital conversation right now. And I just want to invite anyone who really strongly disagrees with anything that we said, just shoot Ari an email, and
Happy
get
to
on his
take it.
calendar. No,
Yeah,
seriously,
we'll sit, we'll talk.
actually, we would love to continue the conversation because we think there's so much to say. And again, such gratitude to Emmanuel Acho and to Noah Tishby for having this conversation, for allowing us to enter into some difficult and uncomfortable areas.
Yeah,
So
including this one. This is a always kind of a touchy place. Thank you, Barry. Thank you for taking the time to talk this through today. Always nice to see you.
It's great to see you too, and we will talk to you all soon. Be well, and we'll see you in our congregations, hopefully.
Yeah. All right, Lee Trout.
Bye-bye.